Hey guys, it's your local Frogman here. Today we're going to talk about Scholar, a shield healer that uses a Ray Bradbury approved Burning Book to protect their allies, as well as a fairy to offset some of the pure healing. To unlock this class, we're going to reach level 30 on Arcanist, go back to the Arcanist Guild in Limsa, and complete the blue class quest Sinking Dos Maga. Scholar has been changed a lot throughout the expansions, and over the years it's always filled this weird niche role of trying to do everything all at once. Scholar used to have an AoE dot, which has since been removed. Back whenever Aeolus and Selene actually had a difference, Selene had an AoE Asuna and a 3% haste buff, which have both been removed since Aeolus and Selene do the same thing now. Back whenever you could actually interact with your pet and you had to make sure your pet didn't die, you could do all different kinds of buffs in your pet, including a shield, magic potency buffs, damage dealt buffs, things like that. Nowadays, with Modern Scholar, you have a pet that can't die, and it gives you a lot of different diverse tools to work with that fills in the gaps of your kit while you're busy doing damage. Currently we have access to two different resource bars, Aether Flow at 45 and the Fairy Gauge at 70. Now if you ever find yourself in a situation where you feel like, man, I really don't know what I should do with my Aether Flow here, don't worry. Nobody knows what they're doing. Even the developers don't know what they're doing. Just use Sacred Soil and pray to God everybody lives. The Aetherflow stacks specifically for healing have been in such a strange limbo state for years, and it doesn't seem like even the developers know exactly what direction they want to take it in. So if you go into a dungeon, you're doing a big pull, put down the bubble. You go into a raid, there's a raid wide, put down the bubble. Oh, what's that? There's going to be a big stack marker? Oh, put down the bubble. Oh, what's that? You want to use Succor? No, don't use Succor, just put down the bubble. Everything will be fine. Another thing worth mentioning is that Scholar also has a raid-wide buff, or technically a boss debuff, Change Stratagem, which makes the boss more susceptible to critical strikes once every 2 minutes. You want to line this up with other raid-wide buffs, similar to other healers like Astrologian, Divination, and White Mage Presence of Mind. Now you might be asking yourself, with all the cool jobs that were released, with all the new awesome abilities that were released in Endwalker, what amazing ability did Scholar get? What big booty blasting Scholar ability, what did they get? They gave you a pair of shoes. They gave you some Nikes. And they nerfed it. They already nerfed it as of 6.1. This is already, the duration has been cut in half. Now granted, this movement speed increase did actually stay in combat for 20 seconds as of the release of Endwalker of 6.0, and it also gave you a 10% damage mitigation, but it seems like the movement speed increase only mattered if you didn't already know where you were supposed to be. If you knew where you were supposed to be and where you needed to go in the future, the movement speed increase didn't matter at all, so why nerf it in the first place, or why even give it to us? Why not just give us a 10% damage mitigation with some other effect, It just seems superfluous. However, it's not all bad news. They did give a bunch of quality of life updates to actually all of the healers. They increased the range of all the different bubbles, especially Estro. They increased mana costs across the board. They increased, or actually decreased, the cast times for all the different healer abilities. It's all around a good time. So with that being said, let's get into the nitty-gritty of how to actually play the class. Dungeons will typically play out the same as you're leveling your Scholar. You'll want to shield your tank pre-pull, although you don't have to. As your tank pulls the pack from point A to point B, you'll want to put a dot on every single one of the enemies as you're running. When the tank reaches point B, you want to put a Sacred Soil down, use a Whispering Dawn, and maybe even an Excog if you think you really need it to give yourself more room to use Art of War and DPS the pack down more. If things start to get really spicy and your tank does a big pull without mitigation or something stupid like that, then you can always do emergency tactics with Adlo. In later levels, you'll have access to other tools like Protraction, which increases your tank's max health, as well as increasing HP recovery, which is super useful. At level 70, your Scholar will have access to the Fairy Gauge, provided they do the proper blue class quest, and be able to use Aether Packs, which will let your Fairy do a continuous heal beam over time, but unable to do any other actions. At level 80, you unlock Seraph, which also gives you the ability to shield and heal your party, but more importantly, it buffs your Embrace heals to also shield for the same amount it heals, essentially doubling the healing on your main tank. Another thing worth mentioning is that whenever you do any kind of boss battle in a dungeon, any trial, any raid, anything like that, you want to throw your fairy directly underneath the boss, right in the middle of the arena as much as possible using the pet hotbar action. It ensures that the pet actions will hit as much of the arena as possible using its AoE abilities. Usually whenever your pet is following you and you use an ability, it will typically miss one of your party members. If it's 8 people and you're running around doing mechanics, it will most likely miss someone. So you want to throw your pet in the middle of the arena, make sure it doesn't move so that it'll hit as many people as possible. But whenever you do this in a dungeon with multiple bosses, or in an alliance raid with multiple bosses, with multiple zones and things like that, sometimes it will actually de-summon your fairies, so be mindful of that and make sure you always have your fairy out. Now, whenever it comes to extreme trials, or normal raids, or savage raids, or harder fights like that, Scholar in general as a shield healer can be a little bit more difficult to learn with, especially if you're not used to doing those kinds of fights. Specifically because as a shield healer, your role is to typically already know the fight ahead of time. As a mitigation healer, you need to know the fight, you need to prepare for mitigating the damage before the damage comes in. But luckily, Scholar, compared to Sage, the other shield healer, is a bit more fleshed out in terms of its toolkit. So while you're still getting used to boss fights and getting used to the order of attacks and things like that, I would highly recommend you hold on to at least one Aetherflow stack while mechanics are still going off. You never really know which person in your party is going to get hit by which mechanic, so it's always important to hold on to at least one Aetherflow stack to sort of mitigate for human error. Whenever you feel like people are getting more experience with the fight and aren't dying as much, you can always use Swiftcast as an emergency heal and use that Aetherflow stack in your damage window for an energy drain. At later levels, your fairy will have so many different tools to use that you'll never really need to use Aetherflow stacks to heal your party, as well as you'll have a co-healer, so you'll never need to use Aetherflow stacks in order to keep your team topped off. You can always use it for energy drain, as well as Sacred Soil. Sacred Soil, as on top of it being damage mitigation, also gets a regen in later levels, so on top of the tools that your fairy gives you, as well as your co-healer, you should never ever need to use Aetherflow stacks for pure healing, like from Lustrate or from Indomitability. Never ever. There's somewhat of an exception to this rule, specifically for dungeons, because you're solo healing for your tank, but in later levels, tanks have so much self-healing, as well as 3 or 4 layers of self-mitigation nowadays in Endwalker, so when healing in dungeons, on top of your fairy healing and shielding, on top of you putting down Sacred Soil for mitigation and regenning, on top of your tank mitigating and self-healing, it's really a matter of just doing damage. So if all of those things aren't enough, it's more than likely a DPS problem, not necessarily a you not healing enough problem. And while we're on that topic, DPS does not mean the red role. DPS is everyone's responsibility. You are the green DPS. Whenever you're not healing, you're DPSing. Like, 85% of your job is DPSing. The main thing that sets apart a good shield healer and a great shield healer is when to heal and when to DPS and when to use which abilities in which situations, and it'll vary between every single situation imaginable. That being said, let's go over some common mistakes that I see a lot of scholars making. Physic. Oh, the adorable Physic spammers. Sometimes I see people spamming Physic at 90 nowadays in dungeons and alliance raids, as if they're stuck in 2017 trying to solo Rama EX on a summoner. Yeah, don't do that. Don't touch it, don't look at it. You can acknowledge its existence, just don't use it. It's pretty terrible. But Frogman, at 85 Physic gets a buff, so it has to be viable. Wrong. A cure potency of 450 is nowhere near good enough to warrant a cast time of 1.5 as well as 1 GCD. The only time you'd ever use this is in some kind of emergency situation at a low level when you have literally no other options. Deployment tactics. Honestly, why is this ability even in the game? I don't think it's been on my hotbar ever since I started playing Scholar. The main purpose of it is to use one shield on one target and then spread the shield to all the surrounding targets. But realistically, the only time you would ever use it is if you accidentally put one Adlo on one target you didn't mean to use it on, and then spread it to everyone else. But the tooltip says that the duration doesn't actually refresh to all the remaining targets, so you're better off just using Sucker on everybody to guarantee that it hits all the other targets, because when you use deployment tactics, it has a 15 yalm radius around the target that you're using it on, so it has a very good chance of missing your entire party versus you going into the middle of your party using Sucker and it basically guaranteeing hitting your entire party. The only way I can see Square Enix salvaging this ability is to actually refresh the duration of the shield and boost the effectiveness of the shield by maybe 50% or something like that, especially whenever it has a 90-second cooldown for an ability that is never used. So yeah, in its current state, just don't even have it on your hotbar. It's useless. Expedient. There isn't a whole lot of ways you can go wrong while using Expedient, but since it has such a unique effect of increasing the move speed of your party for 10 seconds, you need to make sure that you don't use it at the wrong time, because if you use it at the wrong time when a boss is channeling an ability or something, you could accidentally kill people whenever they're trying to make a small movement, they have increased move speed, and then they accidentally make a larger movement than they wanted to, and then they end up going into a non-safe spot and they kill themselves. Anyway guys, that's going to be it from me. Let me know what you thought about my guide on Scholar in the comments below. Be sure to like and subscribe, and I'll see you in the next video. I love you all, take care of yourselves.